neurologists who retired yesterday. You count them with Einstein and Archimedes and everyone else, and there's more scientists and engineers working now, and they have better technology, and it's building on itself. So this is why we're seeing an explosion of technological innovation. A lot of it's great. I mean, we're all living longer. You know, we have antibiotics, although there's some problems there with the superbugs, because it's not a big profit in developing new antibiotics as opposed to vaccines with profits built in, thanks to political structuring. But nonetheless, there's real dangers in what can happen. So I became interested in optogenetics because I'm always studying the interface between humans and machines because I do a lot of work on cyborgs. The problem with controlling people or doing therapies in your brain with just electrical stimulation is electrons are big and fat. You have to think of electrons as just big and unwieldy things. They're not the size of a neuron, they're much smaller, but still, if you're putting electricity into a brain, it's extremely difficult to be discriminatory. So this became such an issue for scientists that about 10, 15 years ago, they seriously started looking into trying to find a way for light to stimulate neurons. Now, how can you use light to stimulate neurons? Neurons aren't sensitive to light. Well, what you have to do is you have to genetically engineer the neurons. Put in a little snippet of genetic material from a creature that uses bioluminescence. Algae are popular, there's certain kind of jellyfish and so on. So that you take that little gene from the fungi that is sensitive to light, you key it so you can target a specific neuron. If you know the genetic code of that neuron, you can send that genetic sort of reprogramming apparatus to that neuron, and suddenly that neuron is sensitive to light. Now you still have to stick things into the brain, but it's fiber optics. And it can be targeted at a specific neuron, one neuron. And easy to do now is groups of 6 or 20 neurons, right? So this is why it's called optogenetics. You genetically modify an organism so its neural tissue is sensitive to light. Sounds like science fiction, doesn't it? And what they've done it to chimps, they've done it to mice, they've done it to nematodes and lizards and rats and so on. Most of the work is with rats for a lot of interesting reasons. My mentor, Donna Haraway, she's written a lot on Oncomouse, the first rat that was bred as an experimental subject. So that's why we use rats so much. Not like rats are a lot like us. Pigs are sort of more like us than rats. I'm just talking biologically, not our personalities. But they use rats the most for these reasons. There's a whole industry of rat science. So what they've gotten the rats to do is, you can take a different type of bioluminescence. You can make the neuron sensitive to one color, green maybe, and also sensitive to red. So what they do is they put both of those in a neuron so they can turn it on and off. Send one pulse of light, the neuron goes off. One pulse of light, the neuron goes on. So they've gotten rats, and they've taught them to be afraid of something, a fear stimulus. And then by the flick of a switch, they send a pulse of light, and the rat's not afraid. Flick the switch, the rat is afraid. It could be something it could know, how to get out of a maze. While it's asleep, they tell it how to get out of the maze. They program its neurons, basically. Rat wakes up, it knows how to get out of the maze. Flick a switch, now it doesn't know how to get out of the maze. Flick a switch, oh, it knows how to get out of the maze. They can make rats go left, go right, and so on. Now, there was a lot of really scary research in the 1950s that was very similar. There was a Professor Delgado from Yale University who advocated the psycho-civilized society. That's what he called it. He testified in Congress. We must put brain implants in all Americans, he said, to keep them from going communist. That was the thing then. And then he had a great video. You can go online and see it. It's a great video. He put a really clunky apparatus on top of a bull and into the bull's fear centers, and he could get a bull, he was Spanish, right? He could get a bull and run at you, and then he flicks a switch, and this goes off, and the bull's afraid, right? It's not on video, but he actually put a thing in the mouse too, and he would get a mouse to chase a bull, right? The mouse is real brave, the bull's afraid, so on like Ferdinand, but with brain implants, right? So that was clunky though, and you can only do really crude kind of interventions. This is when they did all this really interesting research, like showing rats, you know, you put an electrode into the pleasure center of a rat, and you can give it infinite orgasms, right? Rat orgasms are not as good as human orgasms, by the way. Humans have developed a whole complex physiological and cultural apparatus to make our orgasms, some of us think, the best in the animal kingdom. But still, rats do enjoy their orgasms, but not as much as they enjoy nicotine. nicotine, rats give up orgasms, rats give up cocaine, rats give up morphine, rats give up food, rats give up friendship. They'll do anything for that nicotine, right? So that kind of work was ongoing. It's been used crudely to help people in certain situations. We have a good friend, actually, Steve Gooley, who has Parkinson's, and he's had a brain implant to sort of deal with the symptoms of Parkinson's. But it's very crude, and as he gets electrical stimulation to blank out the overexcited neuron cells, which causes Parkinson's symptoms, it leads to other damage and so on. I mean, it's extended his cognitive life, but he's paid a price. This new optogenetics, it promises a lot better interventions. And there's actually even a related area, which I just found. See, I go, oh, optogenetics, I'm such an expert, I know everything. Then about 6 months ago, one of my students said, oh, Professor Gray, what about sonar genetics? I go, sonar genetics? What the fuck? I'm sorry, I cuss a lot. What the fuck is that? And it turns out that some biological tissue has evolved the ability to be sensitive to pressure. Actually, we have some of that in our bodies. And you can actually put that into and to sound. You can put that, connect that to a neuron, and you can control the neuron by sending sound at it, right? But still, I was thinking, oh, well, the good news is not a lot of people are going to want, jellyfish DNA in their brains, only if they have a real mental problem that this might help, So this optogenetics is probably going to be limited for humans. And it hasn't been used on humans yet, the human subjects protocols and so on. You have to expect that it's going to be difficult to get it approved, but it will be approved. I guarantee it, because it will really help some people. Plus, it promises an incredible instrumentalist access to human cognition. But I just found out, I'm doing research for an article I'm writing, it's due February 1st, on bioelectronics, and some smarty pants scientists, they were going, oh, do we really want to genetically modify everything? And they thought, well, what if we took a little atom of gold, a nanoparticle of gold, a few atoms, and we hooked it to a vector that knew the DNA of that neuron, so you can go to the neuron you want. The neuron, some scientists claim that we only had one neuron who knew who Madonna was. I'm sure there's more Madonna neurons in my brain. But in some of you might only have one Madonna neuron, whatever. They find your Madonna neuron, and they could genetically modify it so they could use light to program it. But these guys thought, no, we'll just send a gold nanoparticle to the Madonna neuron, and then we just stimulate with heat, and we stimulated the neuron, and if we get the heat right, we don't damage the neurons, we don't have to do genetic modification. And this gold particle approach looks very promising. So all this means is this will happen sooner, and it can happen with much less actual intervention into the brain. So this is the world we're dealing with. The Department of Defense Applied Research Agency, DARPA, has an $80 million project right in this area of optogenetics. Now it's focused on treating soldiers who've been damaged in war, post-traumatic stress, but it also is aimed at such disorders as oppositional defiant disorder, something which I suspect almost everyone here is suffering from, right? That's when you just cause trouble and the teacher or the cop or the politician or the judge don't like what you're doing, right? This is seen as a true problem by the authorities, and in the military it's seen as a problem. You need a certain level of obedience. This is one of the most rigid and profound hierarchies. So DARPA is putting money in. Obama had a whole year of the brain. Of course, I'm not saying Obama is into mind control. We do know he will order drones to kill people on his own say-so, including American citizens. But I don't think he's really into mind control so much. But he was just told neuroscience can use this push, breakthrough. We need to lead the way, because what if the Chinese or the Russians do it, or the South Koreans, so on, blah, blah, blah. But down the line, we have to ask what's going to come out of this. We've seen with the interweb, which is what I call all of the internet, email, social media together, with the interweb, which started as a military project, right? The military wanted to know if you could have a distributed network that could take a bunch of hits from attacking nuclear weapons and still have a command and control response and manage to blow up the rest of the world. And it hadn't been blown up yet, which is what we all want. The military was also interested in linking together their researchers. So they came up with the idea of packet switching. I won't go into how all that works, but it turns out you can have a distributed, robust network that could lose half its nodes and could still finish off World War III. The thing is, they lost control of that network very quickly. One general called the internet, when it was first starting up, the single biggest anarchist organization in the world, because he kept telling these engineers at Caltech and Stanford and MIT, don't do this, do that. Much of what we know about the internet was invented in spite of the military. Email was invented so these guys could just talk about sports and send dirty, sexist jokes to each other. I mean, they were guys. What can I say? I apologize. It wasn't me. Although I knew some of these people when I was an undergrad at Stanford. It was still around. There was a whole culture of resistance that the internet was part of. Anti-militarization. This was the Vietnam War. Jobs and Wozniak got their start building little boxes so you could steal free phone calls from Ma Bell. Black boxes and blue boxes, right? So that, although Wozniak actually, who I got to meet briefly because his midwife was the same as the midwife that delivered my sons, he's a nice guy. But Jobs I never met, and I don't know if I want to, because he had different interests.
It's too late.
It's too late, I hear, yes. Alternative therapy did him in. But now we see that there's real attempts to leverage these connections to make a different world, one where we are sold what we want, one where what we know is determined by Facebook or Google or The Circle. If you're in my classes, this is a novel about a Google, Facebook, Apple company that ends up taking over the world, right? So there's a few things we should always pay attention to when we're looking at how these new technologies develop. First is cui bono, as the Italians say. Who benefits? And even when something is being developed for all the best reasons, so your grandma, can be cognitively functioning into her 90s, that doesn't mean it doesn't also have the potential for tremendous direct interventions into the brain, right? Another thing to look at is the affordances. Affordances is a term of art, first from design, but it was used in the computer industry when I was there, and it still is. What it means is every technology has certain uses that are easier than others. Like my hat here, right? My hat makes a pretty good thing for drinking water. If I want to fix a tire, it's useless. If I'm involved in hand-to-hand combat, it might be somewhat useful, but not much, right? It has something, some of the uses are afforded by the hat, and other uses are not afforded by the hat. Impossible, getting on my smartphone, which I hardly ever use, as my friends always complain, or watching TV, or helping the Warriors win another game. The hat's useless for any of that, right? It's the same with networks. With a friend of mine, we wrote an article on why alternative, non-hierarchical, horizontalist movements can get so much more out of the interweb. It's because it is distributed, horizontalist, and so on. And why the military, which does hire people to be sock puppets and tries to intervene on it's clunky, it's clumsy, they're hierarchical. It does not mesh with that network. This article is, it's not on technical tour. Well, it's easy enough to find me. My name's on the thing. You can email me. I can send you the article, whatever. I have a lot of articles about these topics. So what do we see is happening with optogenetics? Well, I told you about all the control for the mouse, but what they're doing already is, first comes reading the brain well, right? You have to read before you can write. So using this technology, because for example, if they make the whole brain, they just did this with shrimp, actually just a few months ago, they announced it. They've been doing it for several years. They took all the neurons in the shrimp and they got them all genetically modified so they were they were photosensitive. That way they can mop the real-time cognition of the shrimp. They can see cobalt ions going back and forth and so on and so forth. There's a whole new field of organic machinics, where they make little machines out of organic molecules. This is particular for putting into bodies and putting into organisms and making machinic organic linkages. Now a lot of this will be healthful, right? Once they get little nanobots that can eat cholesterol, I can eat as much Jamaican almond fudge as I want, right? Because it's going to be eating little bots will be eating my cholesterol. It's very likely that there'll be treatments for Alzheimer's and so on with nanobots and so forth. But on the other side, this increased awareness of how the brain works is going to make instrumentalist control of the human brain much more possible. As I said, they can already read thoughts. They can read specific thoughts out of people just with external apparatuses. These deeper interventions will lead just to much more accurate mind reading. There's already one kind of lie detector test that's admissible in the court. Regular lie detector tests are just crap. I know, because I flunked one in 1971 and I was innocent of assault with a deadly weapon on a police officer. All they measure is your fear responses. Galvanic skin response, which means sweating. Respiration, which means heavy beating, heart rate, right? If you're nervous, because you just took a Psych 1 class at Stanford, which told you that lie detector tests are shit, and then they give you a lie detector test, you flunked the lie detector test. Even though I've had my trouble with police, I want to say the reason I did not do 10 years for that was because the officer I was accused of hitting with a rock got up and contradicted what two other cops said said they were, he didn't say they were liars, but they were, and I was let go because of the honesty of one cop. So, just as an aside, don't assume every cop is bad, even if that might be the general tendency, because there are some good cops. I've managed to meet some of them, and he was the first. So while I had two cops lie about me and the cop, the sort of the deadly weapon on Lieutenant Tam of the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office, I had him tell the truth, and he actually outranked them, so that helped. So the lie detector test that is admissible now is one that looks at your brain, real-time three-dimensional brain tomography it's called, and it can tell if you're seeing something for the first time or never before. So if you agree to this, and it is admissible in court, unlike the old lie detector test, they will show you a picture of the crime scene that you said you never saw. You cannot keep your brain from reacting if you have seen it before in one way, and if you've not seen it before, your brain will react in a different way. Same with seeing faces of murder victims, co-conspirators, or whatever. So that's already admissible. Within 20 or 30 years at the most, much more accurate reading of the human brain will be possible, down to specific thoughts. And now you might think, oh, I would be against that. But you know, maybe not you, but maybe your kids, when your kid's gonna get married, don't they wanna like run this test on their fiance and see, is there they really never did sleep with 30 guys at that frat party or whatever. I mean, the temptation, not to mention every businesses test for drug testing all the time. For drug use, they will love to use these kind of tests. Already, many businesses are grabbing on to these technologies, the softer ones that come out of neuroeconomics, neuroadvertising, to vet their potential employees. Is this somebody who's likely to steal, whatever? Using more and more sophisticated cognitive tests to do that. But eventually, as this work continues, I do not see how it can avoid being capable of actually reading your mind. And also it creates a fingerprint, your mind is unique, but then we're just one step away from interventions. And these interventions will be developed for all the best reasons, you know, for therapeutic reasons to help people, but they will also end up being useful for directly controlling people. So we have to wonder, how long can our society survive, even if we manage to survive climate change, even if we don't have a large-scale nuclear war, maybe just a little one that wakes everyone up to that danger. Down the line, these technologies, and they're coming very quickly, probably quicker than I estimate, because it's a geometric curve, the scientific technological development. It's the exact same curve as the number of humans on the planet. It's the exact same curve as the number of extinctions. It's the exact same curve as the disappearance of different languages. It's the exact same curve as the increase in lethality of weapons. It's the exact same curve as the increase in computing power. This is a geometric curve going to a point going almost straight up. And that's where we are now. As the Chinese say when they don't like you, may you live in interesting times. We live in interesting times, the most interesting times. A lot of historians, I've been in a history department, I'm in a disciplinary, HISCON, history of consciousness person, but I've been in a lot of different places. Historians crack me up because they do not think there was anything new under the sun. When you tell the historians, yes, well, the humans can destroy themselves, they go, oh yes, people have been saying that. Why the Mayans said this, and the Romans said it, the Greeks said it. I said, did they have fucking atomic bombs? I mean, no, they didn't. But for the historians, like, this is one of the things they're taught, that there's nothing really new. You know, maybe history repeats itself as farce, or, you know, maybe it just mimics itself, or, you know, it rhymes, history rhymes, like Mark Twain said. But whatever it does, we're at a new place in history because of this technological power. This is what makes us fundamentally human, our ability to manipulate the physical environment and ourselves, modify ourselves. And we have reached this point where this is happening to an extraordinary degree. So before the union talk, we have 8 minutes. Now I will take questions. There's one in the back. You still have a question? No? I thought it was a long. No one has any questions? Yeah?
Well, it can be said that history evolves along moral advancement and then technological advancement, moral advancement. Some historians will make that claim. Do you see a coming moral development that can handle?
That's a great question, because a lot of people will argue that, in fact, humanity's not improving morally at all, but technologically we're improving. But I'm an optimist, and I actually think we are changing. We have mass literacy, we've had mass movements. I'm as critical as anyone here of the United States, and I'm actually now a California independentista. But you have to give the United States credit for the second wave of feminism, for the environmental movement, for gay liberation, not just the United States alone. But this is a country of revolutionaries. It's a country of people who expect more from society. And we see this around the world. I travel a fair amount. I've done research in Egypt looking at the role of social media and the revolution there. I just went to Cuba doing the same, looking at the same thing. We wouldn't say the revolution, the change, whatever. And it's quite interesting. Technology is quite fascinating that way. But what I'm always struck by is how wonderful most people are around the world. More and more people will at least pretend to be feminists. More and more people, right now you can hardly find anyone who will say slavery is a good idea. 100 years ago, there was still a lot of people who said slavery was a great idea. And 150 years ago, it was pretty much a majority opinion, especially among slave owners, among the rich, right? Now, I bet you there are still people who believe in slavery, and a number of them will be in the Trump cabinet, but they will not admit it, at least, right? And they won't admit that they think women are inferior, and they won't say that having an 8-hour day is good, and having the weekend is good, and the children should work. But more and more, this is what the world expects. And so I do think there's more progress. Whether it will happen fast enough, you know, because the dangers are extreme. The danger of these technological mind control that I just introduced you to, that's not the most dangerous thing. The most dangerous thing is still, in my opinion, you know, war, high technology war with nuclear weapons or biological weapons, even more perhaps. The cheap man's nuke. And then comes climate change. But mind control, the manipulation of us is up there. But by just thinking more, by paying attention more, we can resist that easier than we can the international militarized war order or climate change. So I'm a little optimistic. Another question?
Well, the point you just made about people wouldn't say they support slavery, but a lot of people support mass incarceration, which is legalized slavery.
Exactly, very excellent point. And there's actually, besides mass incarceration, there are millions of slaves, right? Children, sex workers, garment workers, even still in LA and sweatshops, but at least everyone runs around pretending they don't. And the mass incarceration has to be sold under a different rubric. But yes, the slavery, we've seen how the imposition of slavery on our culture and the relationship of America to African Americans because of slavery is at the center of what makes us sick. And the Civil War, for all its glory, did not totally expunge the sin of slavery because it was replaced with Jim Crow, and now it's replaced with mass incarceration. And we see that cops shoot down people of all colors, but they particularly shoot down young African American men at a much higher rate. And it's actually their fear. I mean, as you start looking into it, you can notice a lot of these dynamics. You know, how the return of the repressed, you take your fear, you turn it. A lot of these people, they see in others the exact demons that haunt them, right? Like the cops with their fear. So they shoot down people with such impunity. It's because they're afraid, right? So, but excellent point. I'm glad you pointed that out. Okay, we still have 3 minutes. Yeah?
I'm kind of curious as to what kind of regulations you would like to see for these technologies and ones that you already see that you agree with.
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, as an anarchist, I'm really against restricting anyone's freedom. Freedom to explore, even technologies. But what we see is a lot of these technologies happen with massive amounts of public funds. We should not have any public funding by Homeland Security or the military of any of these technologies. It should all be in civilian hands, medical hands. And in fact, in technology in the Netherlands and in England, people have developed this thing where there's a jury of people. Like here we would have a jury impaneled over some scandal, over some police misconduct here, a grand jury. But in England, or Great Britain and the Netherlands, people have a jury that's impaneled to discuss whether they should buy a new MRI machine for the local hospital. And these are just regular citizens, and the experts come in and say, this is why we need an MRI machine. Other doctors say, no, we don't. We should instead have a clinic for the homeless. That will help. That would be a better use of our dollars. And then a group of citizens decide. See, this is citizen science. Citizens have to be more involved in science. The first step is learning how science works, right? Science is always wrong. Science is about noticing you're wrong and getting better. It's a collective peer-reviewed process, but that's deeply flawed by a long history of sexism and racism and so on, and by the general peer pressure. But yes, there's ways we can have a much more democratic intervention in science. But it also has to stop with the government spending money for instrumentalist power needs and also subsidizing corporations. A massive amount of research that's done, ostensibly for the public, is really aimed for corporations, and there's no need for that. We should have doctors and citizens, patients and citizens and nurses, just as they're the ones who should help set up our universal health care. They should be the ones who talk about, well, should we invest all this money in optogenetics, or should we instead maybe invest all this money in a vaccine for malaria? I have a lot of problems with Bill Gates, but he alone, with all his stolen billions, funded a vaccine for malaria because no one would make one because only poor people got malaria. There was no big profit in it, right? There's many diseases like that. That we should focus our techno-scientific apparatuses on decisions that are made democratically more than as they're made hierarchically. And there's all sorts of ways to do this. And in fact, sadly, we're out of time. But this is where a bunch of workers, and you're welcome to stay, are going to talk about how we need more democracy in work, even at the UC. And that is part of the story. Democracy is not just about voting with the repression and with Mr. Orange Hair making everyone excited. Democracy has to be in every element, every aspect of our lives, or we're doomed. On that happy note? Neurologists who retired yesterday. You count them with Einstein and Archimedes and everyone else, and there's more scientists and engineers working now, and they have better technology, and it's building on itself. So this is why we're seeing an explosion of technological innovation. A lot of it's great. I mean, we're all living longer. You know, we have antibiotics, although there's some problems there with the superbugs, because it's not a big profit in developing new antibiotics as opposed to vaccines with profits built in, thanks to political structuring. But nonetheless, there's real dangers in what can happen. So I became interested in optogenetics because I'm always studying the interface between humans and machines because I do a lot of work on cyborgs. The problem with controlling people or doing therapies in your brain with just electrical stimulation is electrons are big and fat. You have to think of electrons as just big and unwieldy things. They're not the size of a neuron, they're much smaller, but still, if you're putting electricity into a brain, it's extremely difficult to be discriminatory. So this became such an issue for scientists that about 10, 15 years ago, they seriously started looking into trying to find a way for light to stimulate neurons. Now, how can you use light to stimulate neurons? Neurons aren't sensitive to light. Well, what you have to do is you have to genetically engineer the neurons. Put in a little snippet of genetic material from a creature that uses bioluminescence. Algae are popular, there's certain kind of jellyfish and so on. So that you take that little gene from the fungi that is sensitive to light, you key it so you can target a specific neuron. If you know the genetic code of that neuron, you can send that genetic sort of reprogramming apparatus to that neuron, and suddenly that neuron is sensitive to light. Now you still have to stick things into the brain, but it's fiber optics. And it can be targeted at a specific neuron, one neuron. And easy to do now is groups of 6 or 20 neurons, right? So this is why it's called optogenetics. You genetically modify an organism so its neural tissue is sensitive to light. Sounds like science fiction, doesn't it? And what they've done it to chimps, they've done it to mice, they've done it to nematodes and lizards and rats and so on. Most of the work is with rats for a lot of interesting reasons. My mentor, Donna Haraway, she's written a lot on Onco mouse. Flick the switch, the rat is afraid. It could be something it could know how to get out of a maze. While it's asleep, they tell it how to get out of the maze. They program its neurons, basically. Rat wakes up, it knows how to get out of the maze. Flick a switch, now it doesn't know how to get out of the maze. Flick a switch, oh, it knows how to get out of the maze. They can make rats go left, go right, and so on. Now, there was a lot of really scary research in the 1950s that was very similar. There was a Professor Delgado from Yale University who advocated the psycho-civilized society. That's what he called it. He testified in Congress. We must put brain implants in all Americans, he said, to keep them from going communist. That was the thing then. And then he had a great video. You can go online and see it. It's a great video. He put a really clunky apparatus on top of a bull and into the bull's fear centers, and he could get a bull. He was Spanish, right? The first rat that was bred as an experimental subject. So that's why we use rats so much. Not like rats are a lot like us. Pigs are sort of more like us than rats. I'm just talking biologically, not our personalities. But they use rats the most for these reasons. There's a whole industry of rat science. So what they've gotten the rats to do is, you can take a different type of bioluminescence. You can make the neuron sensitive to one color, green maybe, and also sensitive to red. So what they do is they put both of those in a neuron so they can turn it on and off. Send one pulse of light, the neuron goes off. One pulse of light, the neuron goes on. So they've gotten rats, and they've taught them to be afraid of something, a fear stimulus. And then by the flick of a switch, they send a pulse of light, and the rat's not afraid.